For 3 years, an entire nation was forbidden from getting married. No weddings, no meat, no wine, no music. All because one man, a man most of them had never seen in person, never spoken to, never met, had died. This wasn't grief. This was law. And it's just the beginning of one of the strangest facts about ancient China. In a civilization run on some of history's strictest legal codes, even your sadness had a rulebook. Cross a stranger on the street during a funeral procession, and just by looking at the cloth on their back, you could tell them exactly how the dead person was related to them, a father, a cousin, a stranger, because the fabric itself was legislated, down to the weave. Here's the question today. What actually happened, step by step, when someone died in ancient China? And how far did the state's obsession with rules reach into something as private as loss? Here's what's coming. Why an emperor's death could shut down weddings for an entire country. The rulebook so detailed it told you exactly how loudly you were allowed to cry, depending on who died. The government job that legally required you to quit the moment your father passed away. And at the very end, a woman who died over 2,000 years ago and was found so well preserved that doctors could still tell you what she'd eaten for her last meal. Let's go. Here's the thing nobody tells you about death in ancient China. We tend to picture it through the monuments, through Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum, through the terracotta army, through jade and gold and thousands of clay soldiers, built to guard an emperor forever. That's death as spectacle, and it's real, but it's also the tiny visible fraction of something much bigger. For every emperor with an army of clay, there were millions of ordinary families who buried a parent, a spouse, a child, following a set of rules so exhaustive that almost nothing was left to instinct. What to wear, how long to grieve, when you were allowed to speak, and when you weren't. The instructions survive because, like almost everything else in this era, someone eventually wrote them down. The core document is called the Li Ji, the Book of Rites, compiled between the late Warring States period and the early Han. Right around the same decades Xi was filing his corvée statutes, a few hundred miles away. And the Li Ji does not read like a religious text. It reads like a procedure manual, announcing a death, preparing the body, what to wear based on your exact relationship to the deceased, how long each stage of mourning should last. It is, in its own way, the emotional equivalent of the Yaolu, a state-shaped, exhaustively documented answer to a question most civilizations left to custom and left unwritten. So let's walk through what actually happened. The moment someone died, the household's first job was public notice. The death had to be formally announced to the family and community before anything else happened. Then came the body itself. It was ritually washed, dressed, and prepared for the coffin, a process the sources call encoffining, carried out with specific steps and a specific order, because doing it wrong was itself a kind of failure toward the dead. Then came the clothing, and this is where the system gets genuinely intricate. Ancient China ran on what's called the 5 grades of mourning dress, a formal system, already established by the Zhou and Qin dynasties, that assigned a specific fabric, weave, and hem to every possible family relationship. Your own children wore the coarsest hemp available, rough, unfinished, deliberately uncomfortable, with a ragged, unhemmed edge, because a neat hem would have suggested you cared more about appearance than grief. Grandchildren wore something slightly finer. More distant relatives, finer still, down through 5 distinct grades. A stranger glancing at your clothing during a funeral procession could tell, at a distance, exactly how closely you were related to the person in the coffin. Grief, in other words, had a dress code, and the dress code was law. The procession itself followed a fixed order. The eldest son led it, carrying a white band of mourning. The second son followed behind, holding the memorial tablet. Other relatives carried sticks wrapped in white paper. Before the coffin was lifted, there were farewell rites, wine scattered on the ground, a funeral oration read aloud, incense offered, formal bows performed in sequence. None of this was improvised in the moment. It had already been written down, generations earlier, in the Li Ji, so that a grieving family never had to guess what came next. And then there was the length of the mourning itself, which is where the state stops being a quiet background presence and becomes the loudest voice in the room. During the Qin dynasty and the beginning of the Han, when an emperor died, the entire country went into mourning for 3 years. Not just the palace, not just the nobility, the whole population, dressed in mourning cloth, forbidden meat, forbidden wine, forbidden weddings, forbidden entertainment, all of it enforced by law, for 3 full years, over the death of a single man most of them had never seen in person. Eventually, one emperor looked at that system and decided it had gone too far. Let's take a step back. Emperor Wen of Han, remembered across Chinese history as one of its more restrained and practical rulers, ruled that a 3-year national shutdown over an emperor's death was an unreasonable burden to place on ordinary people trying to farm, trade, and simply survive. He shortened the mandatory public mourning period to 36 days and limited the harshest restrictions to nobles and officials, the people closest to the throne. It's a strange kind of law to make, a ruler legislating the size of his own future funeral, specifically to spare the people he governed from having to grieve him on a government timetable. But inside individual families, the rules stayed serious, and nowhere more than inside the government itself. There was a practice called dingyou, literally encountering sorrow, which began as official policy during the Han Dynasty and lasted for centuries afterward. If your parent or grandparent died, and you held a government post, you were legally required to resign immediately. Not take leave. Resign. You returned to your hometown and observed a mourning period nominally set at 3 years, though in practice closer to 25 or 27 months. Banned, for that entire stretch, from banqueting, from marriage, from any official activity, from even sitting the imperial exams that could restart your career. At the end of it, if a position was available, you might be reinstated at your old rank. If not, your career simply absorbed the loss. In a civilization obsessed with bureaucratic advancement, the same civilization where she spent a lifetime climbing from scribe to clerk to prison officer, grief could stop a career in its tracks, by law, and nobody was exempted for being useful. Away from the palace and the civil service, archaeology tells us something the official texts leave out almost entirely: what ordinary families actually did at the graveside. Excavations of Eastern Han commoner burials, a study of 274 individual grave structures, found something unexpected. Some tombs included a second, narrower ramp built into the earth after the main burial had already been sealed. Archaeologists now believe families used that ramp to physically re-enter the tomb chamber after the funeral, to make additional offerings to the dead. This is a striking detail, because ancient Chinese culture had a well-documented fear of restless spirits. Going back into a sealed tomb was not something you did lightly. The best explanation historians have is filial piety, the Confucian obligation to honor your parents, pushed to a degree that it overrode a genuine fear of the dead. Even families who left no written record at all were still, in their own way, following the same underlying logic as the Li Ji. The dead were owed something, and the debt didn't end at the funeral. Now here's where it gets good, because for one family, we don't have to reconstruct any of this from a rulebook. We can actually check the paperwork against the body. In 1972, construction workers digging an air raid shelter near Changsha, in Hunan province, broke into something nobody expected: a sealed underground tomb, more than 40 feet down, wrapped in 5 tons of charcoal and a thick layer of white clay. Inside, nested 4 coffins deep, was the body of a noblewoman who had died around 168 BCE. Her name was Xin Jui, remembered today as Lady Dai, wife of the Marquis of Dai. And when archaeologists finally opened that innermost coffin, they found something that briefly stopped Chinese archaeology in its tracks. After more than 2,000 years underground, her skin was still soft. Her joints still moved. Her hair, her eyelashes, even her fingerprints were intact. On December 14, 1972, doctors performed a full autopsy on a body over 2,000 years old. They found blood clots consistent with a heart attack, complicated by gallstones, diabetes, and severely hardened arteries. And in her stomach, they found roughly 130 melon seeds, swallowed whole, eaten only 2 to 3 hours before she died. Which means we don't just know how Lady Di died. We know, almost to the hour, what her last afternoon looked like. Here's the detail that connects everything we've just walked through. Archaeologists studying her tomb noted something specific. It contained no jade and no precious metal grave goods, which was unusual for a noblewoman of her wealth and status. The reason is that her burial followed the sumptuary restrictions instituted under Emperor Wen of Han, the exact same emperor who shortened the national mourning period from 3 years to 36 days. The same ruler who decided grief shouldn't bankrupt the living was also the one who decided funerals shouldn't be looted from the treasury. Two reforms, one underlying idea, showing up in two completely different places 2,000 years apart, a law book and a 2,000-year-old stomach. Let's take a step back, because there are three things here. First, death in ancient China wasn't just a private family matter. It was one of the most heavily regulated experiences a person could have, governed by written law with the same precision the state applied to labor and punishment. Second, that regulation cut in two directions at once. It was a genuine burden, capable of ending careers and shutting down weddings nationwide, and at the same time a form of protection, eventually reformed by rulers who recognized when the burden had gone too far. Third, we only get to verify any of it because two completely different kinds of evidence happened to survive: a rule book that told people what they were supposed to do, and, in one extraordinary case, a body that let us check whether reality matched the paperwork. Here's what I keep coming back to. Somewhere around 168 BCE, a wealthy woman sat down, ate a bowl of melon, and died within hours, with no idea that her body would outlast her entire dynasty, her language's grammar, and every emperor who came after her, and that 2,000 years later, in a country she never imagined, someone would know exactly what she'd eaten. Most of the people who followed the mourning rules in this video left nothing behind at all. She left almost everything. So, question for you. 3 years of national mourning, no weddings, no meat, no wine, over the death of a ruler you'd never met. Could you have lasted the 3 years, or would you have been grateful for Emperor Wen's 36 days? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe so we can keep digging up the parts of history that never made it onto the monuments. Until then, see you soon.